In the stillness of a moonless night, beneath a swaying gallows tree, a newborn baby took his first breath. This child came into the world in the most tragic way imaginable, born from the lifeless body of his mother, who had been hanged among many corpses. Yet, against all odds, the infant survived, crying softly amid the cold and darkness. A band of mercenaries passing by the grim scene discovered the baby. One kind-hearted woman, a camp follower named Shisu, cradled the child in her arms. She saw not an omen of death, but a fragile new life in need of warmth. The grizzled leader of the mercenaries, Gambino, begrudgingly allowed Shisu to care for the boy. They named him Guts, for the baby had the guts to cling to life even when hope seemed lost. Shisu became the only gentle presence in Guts's early life. In a mercenary camp filled with hardened warriors and constant skirmishes, she did her best to shield the boy and give him affection. For a few brief years, the child knew a mother's tender touch and lullabies hummed under the whispering trees at night. But such peaceful moments were fleeting on the battlefield. When Guts was just a toddler, Shisu fell ill with a deadly plague. Despite the little boy's attempts to comfort her, bringing water and holding her feverish hand, Shisu slipped away one quiet night, leaving Guts truly alone. After Shisu's death, Gambino took charge of raising Guts, though raising might be too kind a word. Gambino was a warrior first and a reluctant guardian second. He taught Guts to wield a sword almost as soon as the boy could walk. Because Guts was so small, Gambino gave him a sword nearly as tall as he was, forcing the child to build strength just to swing it. Each day was filled with harsh training drills, marches through mud and rain, and the cacophony of battle. By the time he was barely 9 years old, Guts was being sent to fight on the front lines alongside grown men. Battle became the backdrop of Guts's childhood. The mercenary band roamed from one conflict to another, and Guts grew up knowing only the nomadic, violent life of war. He learned to swing a sword before he could read, to guard himself before he could trust anyone. Amid the chaos of clashing steel and thundering hooves, the boy found a strange solace. The sword in his hands felt steady and reliable when nothing else in life was. Each narrow survival on the battlefield was proof that he was still alive in a world that had given him little reason to live. Yet beneath Guts's toughened exterior lay a lonely child starved for affection. In the evenings, around the campfires, he often sat a slight distance apart, quietly oiling his sword or staring into the flames. The other mercenaries would drink and laugh boisterously, recounting the day's skirmish, while Guts remained watchful and silent. Without Shisu's warmth, the nights felt colder. Sometimes, as he drifted to sleep on the hard ground, he would hum the faint memory of one of her lullabies and imagine for a moment that he wasn't alone. One night, in the darkness of a tent, lit only by a sliver of moonlight, something happened that scarred Guts more deeply than any battle wound. Gambino, desperate for coin and clouded by drink, allowed one of his mercenaries, a cruel man named Donovan, to enter Guts's tent and violate the boy's small trust and body. In that murky darkness, Guts endured an unspeakable trauma at an age far too young to fully comprehend it. He only knew afterward that something precious had been shattered inside him. The next day, on the battlefield, Guts confronted Donovan with a cold, quiet fury burning in his chest. Amid the chaos of battle, the 9-year-old buried his sword into Donovan, avenging the wrong in the only way he understood. As Donovan lay dying, he revealed with a sneer that it was Gambino who had sold Guts to him for a few coins. This revelation hit Guts harder than any physical blow. In the days that followed, the boy's world grew even darker. He pushed himself harder in every drill and skirmish, perhaps hoping to earn a word of praise or a sliver of approval from Gambino, the only father figure he had. But Gambino's gaze only grew colder. Not long after, Gambino's leg was gravely injured by a cannon blast in battle, ending his days as a frontline fighter. The once proud mercenary leader was reduced to hobbling on a crutch, and bitterness festered in him like an infection. He began to see Guts not as a son or even a useful fighter, but as a curse, a child born from a corpse whom he blamed for every misfortune, from Shisu's death to his own crippling injury. One fateful night, Gambino, drowning in drink and despair, stumbled into Guts's tent, armed with a sword. Rain drummed on the canvas overhead as the old mercenary's shadow loomed over the boy. With slurred words, Gambino hissed all his hatred at Guts, calling him a devil's child who should have died beneath his mother's body. Guts's heart pounded with confusion and fear as he realized the man he looked up to intended to kill him. Gambino's blade sliced down, but the years of training he had drilled into Guts saved the boy's life. Guts instinctively rolled aside, the blade grazing him, and in a desperate defense, he grabbed his own sword. There was a brief struggle, lightning illuminating the tent in stark flashes, and then Gambino fell. Guts's sword had run him through. The old warrior collapsed to the ground, shock and pain flickering across his face. Guts scrambled to his side, blood and rainwater mixing on the tent floor. He hadn't meant to kill Gambino. In that instant he was once again just a child terrified of losing the only parent he knew. But Gambino's eyes stared through him, empty and still. The commotion brought other mercenaries running. They burst in to find a scene from a nightmare. Young Guts kneeling over Gambino's corpse, wide-eyed and shaking, the bloody sword still in his hands. Shouts of rage and horror erupted. To them it looked like the boy had murdered their commander in cold blood. Guts barely had time to plead or explain before the men rushed at him with weapons drawn. Tears mingling with rain on his cheeks, Guts fled into the stormy night. He ran through the camp, heart pounding, dodging between tents as thunder rumbled overhead. Arrows whistled past him. He had no one left, no one to defend him. Chased to the edge of the camp, Guts found himself cornered at the top of a steep embankment slick with mud. The mercenaries closed in, their torches bobbing through the darkness. Panicked and with nowhere to run, Guts swung his sword wildly to keep them back. He managed to wound one man, then another. But there were too many. In the chaos, the ground gave way beneath Guts's feet. With a startled cry, he tumbled down the embankment and off a small cliff, disappearing into the blackness below. The mercenaries peered over the edge, but saw nothing in the torrent of rain and darkness. Believing the boy either dead from the fall, or as good as dead lost in the wild, they grudgingly let the night swallow him. Guts survived the fall, landing hard, but managing not to break any bones. He found himself in a swollen stream at the bottom of the ravine. The cold water shocked his system, and he dragged himself to the bank, lungs heaving, alone, drenched, and exhausted. The boy collapsed beneath a large tree for shelter. He was alive, but everything he had known was gone. His comrades, his mentor flawed as he was, his place in the mercenary band, all had vanished in a single tragic night. As dawn's first gray light crept into the sky, Guts sat shivering and aching, clutching his heavy sword with numb fingers. He was 11 years old and utterly alone. Thus Guts's childhood ended in blood and sorrow beneath those lonely trees. It was a cruel beginning in a cruel world. Each step he had taken in life so far came with the weight of heartbreak on his small shoulders. Yet within that boy burned a quiet resilience that refused to die. Life had tried to break him again and again, but Guts kept getting back up. Now, with no home, no family, and no mentor, he faced a hostile world completely on his own. Blinking away tears and rain, Guts pushed himself to his feet. He sheathed his sword, and with nowhere to go but forward, started walking. In that moment, he became a solitary struggler against the darkness of fate, determined to survive on his own terms. Years passed, as Guts wandered from battlefield to battlefield, growing from a hardened boy into a formidable young warrior. By his mid-teens, he had built a fearsome reputation as a mercenary who never stayed with one company for long. He was taller now, strong and lean, with cold, vigilant eyes and a scar across the bridge of his nose. He still carried a sword nearly as tall as himself, having learned to wield such massive blades with deadly skill. Wherever a war raged, the lone swordsman drifted through, selling his sword to whoever paid, but never truly belonging. In combat, Guts was ferocious and relentless, channeling all his anger and pain into each swing of his weapon. The chaos of battle was simpler than the chaos in his heart. On the field, he only had to worry about surviving the next moment. And survive he did, through battle after battle, as if some dark, stubborn spark kept him alive when lesser men would have fallen. One summer day, on the outskirts of a besieged fortress, Guts found himself locked in single combat with a notorious knight known as Bazuso the Bear Slayer. Bazuso was a hulking man in heavy armor, wielding a battle axe so massive it could cleave a horse in two. Many soldiers on Guts's side whispered that engaging Bazuso was suicide, but Guts, motivated by the challenge and the promised gold reward for Bazuso's head, stepped forward without fear. Under the blistering afternoon sun, and amid the din of an ongoing skirmish, Guts and Bazuso dueled before crowds of astonished onlookers on both sides. Bazuso brought his giant axe down with thunderous force, and Guts met it with his great sword. The clash of metal rang out as sparks flew. Bazuso expected this upstart youth to falter or flee after a few blows, but Guts's determination was unyielding. He pressed on, sword swinging with uncanny strength. With a final roar, Guts shattered Bazuso's axe in mid-swing and drove his sword through the gap in the knight's armor. Bazuso fell to the ground, defeated and disbelief in his eyes, as cheers and gasps erupted from the watching soldiers. Guts stood over the corpse, chest heaving, his blade dripping with the blood of a foe many thought unbeatable. Claiming his reward of gold from the fortress command, Guts left the battlefield quietly, not realizing that his astonishing victory had caught the eye of someone who would change his destiny. Watching from a distant hilltop was a band of mercenaries new to the area, the Band of the Hawk. They were an up-and-coming force renowned for swift, decisive tactics, led by a young and brilliant commander named Griffith. Griffith, from afar, had witnessed the duel between Guts and Bazuso through a telescope. The lone swordsman's skill and ferocity intrigued him deeply. There was something about Guts, the raw intensity in his movements, the absence of hesitation or fear, that struck a chord in Griffith as more than mere talent. With a slight confident smile and a toss of his snowy white hair, Griffith decided then and there that he wanted this formidable youth in his band. Later that evening, as dusk settled and Guts traveled alone across an open field, the Band of the Hawk made their move. Without warning, a group of riders and footmen emerged from the trees and surrounded Guts. Their sudden appearance startled him. Guts's hand flew to his sword hilt. From among them stepped a young woman clad in light armor, with fierce eyes and flowing brown hair, Casca, a commander in the Hawks. Acting on Griffith's orders, Casca and her men attempted to subdue Guts and bring him in. They hadn't expected the fight that followed. Exhausted from the earlier duel yet unwilling to surrender, Guts reacted like a cornered tiger. He swung his massive blade with fearsome power, forcing the Hawks to keep their distance. In the fray, Casca charged at Guts on horseback, trying to disarm him. Guts met her attack head-on, knocking her from her horse. She hit the ground hard, stunned and angered that this stranger had bested her so quickly. Before Casca could scramble up to continue the fight, a commanding voice cut through the tension. "Stop." The voice was calm yet firm, instantly obeyed by all the Hawks. The circle of mercenaries parted, to let their leader through. Griffith came riding in on a white steed, the dying light of sunset painting him in gold and crimson. Guts, breathing heavily, watched warily as this graceful young commander dismounted and approached. Griffith's appearance was almost otherworldly. Fine-boned features, hair as pale as moonlight, and eyes a striking shade of icy blue. Unlike the rough mercenaries Guts was used to, Griffith looked noble and composed, an almost gentle smile on his lips, despite the confrontation at hand. In a courteous tone, Griffith introduced himself and praised Guts' skill, mentioning he had seen the fight with Bazuso. Guts, still bristling from combat, demanded to know what they wanted with him. Griffith calmly explained that he wished for Guts to join the band of the Hawk. To a boy who had known only abandonment in mercenary life, Griffith's polite request and soft admiration were disarming, but Guts' pride flared. He flatly refused. He was not someone to be recruited like a pawn. If Griffith wanted him, Guts growled, he'd have to prove he could make him join. A spark of amusement lit in Griffith's eyes at that challenge, and he agreed. He proposed a duel. If Griffith won, Guts would swear to join the Hawks. If Guts won, he would be free to go. They moved to a grassy clearing as the sky deepened to violet. Casca, angry and concerned, protested. She thought it unfair for Griffith to risk himself. But Griffith gave her a gentle glance that conveyed he had matters in hand. Guts and Griffith readied their weapons. The surrounding Hawks formed a loose circle, watching with bated breath. Fireflies began to flicker in the dimness as the two faced off. Guts, already tired and freshly wounded from the day's battles, gripped his great sword tightly, every muscle tense. Griffith drew a slender saber, designed more for finesse than brute force, and stood relaxed yet poised. For a heartbeat, they locked eyes. Guts's gaze was full of defiance and guarded loneliness. Griffith's was calm, confident, and unreadable. Griffith made the first move. He darted in with incredible speed, striking toward Guts's side. Guts parried, metal ringing out. He retaliated with a heavy downward slash, meant to end things immediately. But Griffith was swift as a breeze. He sidestepped the blow entirely. Guts's sword bit into empty earth. In that flash, Griffith pivoted and delivered a quick slash along Guts's forearm. Not deep, but enough to startle. Guts gritted his teeth. This man was faster than anyone he'd fought. The duel continued. Guts pressed with brute strength, powerful swings carving through the air, while Griffith gracefully evaded or deflected, looking almost serene. Despite his fatigue, Guts's determination blazed. He refused to lose. Finally, Guts saw an opening and lunged with all his might, aiming to knock Griffith off balance. But Griffith had anticipated this. Instead of dodging fully, he stepped in too close for Guts's long sword to be effective. Before Guts could react, Griffith slammed his own body into Guts, using a wrestling move rather than a sword strike. The two fell to the grass in a tangle. Guts' sword flew from his grip. In a swift motion, Griffith twisted Guts's arm behind his back and pinned him down, his knee on Guts's spine. Guts struggled mightily, muscles burning, but Griffith held firm with surprising strength. A hush fell over the Hawks. Their leader had subdued the fierce warrior. Panting, Guts felt the cool tip of Griffith's saber rest against the back of his neck. It was over. He had lost. For the first time in years, Guts found himself at another's mercy. Memories of Gambino pinning him down with a blade flooded unbidden into his mind, and a spike of panic and shame went through him. "Do you surrender?" came Griffith's voice, quiet and oddly gentle. Guts, swallowing his pride along with a sting of tears he would never let show, growled out that he yielded. Griffith released him at once, and stood, extending a hand to help Guts up. Guts, chest heaving and exhausted, hesitated, then took that hand. It was a gesture unlike any he'd known, not gloating or cruelty, but genuine camaraderie. Griffith's smile was warm as he said, "You fought well." In that moment, Guts was more disarmed by kindness than he had been by force. True to the duel's conditions, Guts was now bound to join the band of the Hawk. Though resentment and reluctance churned in him at being forced, a part of him also felt an unexpected relief. These people hadn't killed him or cast him out. Instead, they were welcoming him into their ranks. It was foreign and strange, and perhaps a little hopeful. Back at the Hawk-Sipped camp, a large bonfire crackled under the starry sky. Guts-Sipped's wounds were seen to by the group Sipped's medic, and by Casca, who despite her earlier anger, begrudgingly ensured the new recruit didn't bleed to death overnight. Wrapped in a blanket near the warmth of the flames, Guts finally allowed his tired body to relax. All around, Hawks ate, laughed, and chatted boisterously. Some approached to pat Guts on the back and introduce themselves. Judo, a friendly youth, with a talent for knives and a ready grin. Pippin, a quiet giant of a man who offered Guts a hearty bowl of stew. Corcus, a sharp-tongued veteran who scowled skeptically at Guts, still salty that Griffith had taken interest in him. Amid these introductions, Guts felt overwhelmed. He wasn't used to friendly faces and casual camaraderie. Griffith sat with him by the fire at one point, explaining the Hawks' current campaign and what Guts's role would be. His tone was light and confident, as if he had no doubt Guts would become one of his best men. Guts found himself hanging on Griffith's every word. There was a charisma about him, a sense of vision and purpose that was magnetic. When Griffith spoke of the Hawks' future and dreams, even cynical Corcus paused to listen. That night, as most of the band fell asleep under the open sky, Guts remained awake a while, lying on his back and gazing up at the stars. The night was peaceful. He realized with a cautious wonder that this was the first time in as long as he could remember that he wasn't alone. There were sleeping figures all around him, comrades, allies, perhaps even friends. In time, the warmth of the fire and the gentle snoring of the other mercenaries felt strangely comforting. Guts closed his eyes, the faint ghost of a smile on his lips. He drifted into one of the deepest dreamless sleeps he'd had in years, as if some burden had temporarily eased from his scarred shoulders. For the first time he belonged to a group, the Band of the Hawk, and though he would never have admitted it out loud, that thought soothed the lonely ache in his heart. Life with the Band of the Hawk was unlike anything Guts had experienced before. In the months that followed his fateful meeting with Griffith, Guts transformed from a solitary fighter into a key member of a tightly knit mercenary company. The Hawks quickly learned that Guts was a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield, and under Griffith's command, he was given responsibility and trust. Guts, in turn, found himself, almost unconsciously, caring about the fate of those who fought beside him. Battle by battle, the Band of the Hawk rose to prominence in the Kingdom of Midland's ongoing war, and Guts was often at the forefront of their victories. With Griffith's strategic genius and Guts's unstoppable might as the tip of the spear, the Hawks won battle after battle, even against overwhelming odds. Their reputation soared. Rumors spread through ranks of friend and foe alike of the Hawks' fearless raiders captain, Guts, who could cleave a man in half with one swing of his great sword. For Guts, these years were like a whirlwind. For the first time, he was fighting not just for himself, but for a leader and comrades he respected. Surrounded by the companionship of the Hawks, Guts slowly began to open up. He found true comrades in this band. Judo, the resourceful knife thrower, who had greeted him warmly on his first night, became a close friend, often giving Guts pointers on social graces or listening when Guts chose to speak of his past, which wasn't often. But Judo had a way of listening without prying. Pippin, the big gentle giant, would wordlessly share his rations with Guts on long marches, or sit with him in comfortable silence on guard duty shifts. Even Corcus, who initially bristled at Guts's inclusion, eventually thawed after Guts proved his worth time and again. Their relationship turned into a playful rivalry, with Corcus often griping about Guts's recklessness, while grudgingly acknowledging his prowess. Rickard, the youngest member of the Hawks barely in his early teens, looked up to Guts as a hero and older brother figure, following him around whenever he could, and eagerly polishing Guts's armor or fetching him water after training. At first, Guts kept these would-be friends at arm's length, unsure how to handle camaraderie beyond battlefield cooperation. But over time, he found himself laughing, a rare surprised chuckle at one of Judo's jokes, or gently mussing Rickard's hair when the boy did well, or sitting with Pippin in easy quiet after a hard fight. Bit by bit, Guts's guarded heart felt the warmth of acceptance and brotherhood. Most significant of all was Gutsy's evolving relationship with Casca. As the Hawk's second-in-command and Griffith's most loyal confidant, Casca had initially resented Guts. She worried that Griffith's attention to this newcomer might threaten the cohesion of the group, and if she admitted it to herself, she felt a twinge of personal jealousy. Casca had dedicated her life to Griffith's dream, and held a deep, complicated affection for him. Seeing Griffith take such interest in Guts so quickly had made her cautious and a bit hostile. In the early days, she often scolded Guts for his reckless fighting style, or his tendency to act independently rather than as part of a unit. Guts, bristling at authority, especially from someone his own age, would snap back, leading to heated spats between them. Other Hawks would joke that you could hear Captain Casca and Captain Guts bickering from a mile away. But conflict gave way to respect, as they fought side by side in real battles. In one early engagement, Casca's unit became surrounded by enemy knights during an ambush. Guts, disobeying an order to hold the line, charged in to break the encirclement and rescue Casca and her men. His bold intervention turned the tide, and though Casca berated him afterward for ignoring orders, she couldn't deny that without Guts's action, many of her soldiers and perhaps Casca herself would have fallen. On another occasion, Guts sustained a serious wound while ensuring Casca wasn't overrun by enemy spearmen. As she dressed his wound by the campfire that night, her touch was gentler than her tongue, and Guts saw genuine concern in her eyes instead of the usual irritation. "Why put yourself in danger like that for me?" she asked quietly. Guts simply shrugged, saying it was the job, and that he knew she'd do the same for him. Casca found she couldn't argue with that. It was true. A mutual trust was starting to form. Over months of campaigning together, Guts and Casca's rapport deepened. They learned to fight in tandem almost instinctively. Casca, ever pragmatic and disciplined, helped Guts refine his approach from a lone berserker style to one that could coordinate with the Hawk's strategies. Guts' presence in turn gave Casca a newfound sense of security in battle. She knew if things went awry, Guts would be there like an immovable pillar to hold the line. Outside of battle, their interactions softened. They still bantered and argued. Casca would call Guts a mad dog for charging off, and Guts would tease her for being uptight, but there was camaraderie beneath the barbs. Around the evening campfires, sometimes Casca would sit next to Guts as he maintained his sword, and she'd speak quietly about the day's fight or about Griffith's plans. Guts mostly listened, not always responding, but Casca didn't mind. In those small moments, a quiet understanding grew. They were both warriors who lived for battle and loyalty, and in each other they recognized a kindred spirit of dedication to the Hawks. Under Griffith's leadership, the Band of the Hawk became the vaunted Grim Reapers of the battlefield, winning one key battle after another in the long war between Midland and its rival kingdom, Tudor. Guts took command of the Hawks' raiders, leading daring offensives that punched holes in enemy formations. His fearlessness inspired those following him. Men would charge into the fray with Guts and later cheer about how he'd slain dozens, turning the tide. Casca commanded the main forces deftly under Griffith's directives, and Griffith himself often executed brilliant flanking maneuvers that won battles with minimal losses. Together they were an almost unstoppable team. Not all was triumphant glory, of course. The Hawks endured grueling sieges and hard winters in the field. During one prolonged campaign, Casca fell ill from exposure while the Hawks were trapped behind enemy lines. Guts spent a frigid night holding her shivering body to keep her warm in a cave, an intimacy born of necessity that neither spoke of afterward, but neither forgot. In that dark cave, Casca, feverish and vulnerable, had murmured pieces of her past to Guts, about how Griffith had given her a sword and purpose when she was just a helpless girl, how she would follow him anywhere. Guts listened, understanding for the first time the depth of Casca's devotion to their mutual leader. When dawn came and her fever broke, Casca woke in Guts's arms, startled and embarrassed. They quickly separated, masking any awkwardness with snarky remarks, but something subtle had shifted. A seed of gentle affection planted in that cold cave. One of the most harrowing trials for the Hawks came during a massive battle at a fortress called Doldry, a heavily fortified stronghold thought impregnable. Midland's forces had struggled for years to capture it. The band of the Hawk was chosen to lead the assault, a testament to their renown. In the decisive charge, Guts faced the famed Tudor General Bosco, a knight said to be as strong as an ogre in single combat amidst the melee. The duel was fierce, with Bosco's lance nearly impaling Guts and Guts's sword striking sparks off the general's plated armor. But Guts, indomitable, eventually struck Bosco down, shattering both the general's weapon and the morale of the fortress's defenders. Meanwhile, Griffith executed a brilliant feint that lured the enemy's main forces out of position, and Casca led a contingent to seize the fortress's gates from within. By day's end, Doldry fell and the war was effectively won for Midland. The victory at Doldry brought the band of the Hawk unrivaled fame. They returned to the capital as heroes. For a brief time, the mercenaries who had lived rough in the mud found themselves guests of honor in gilded halls. A grand victory ceremony was held in Wyndham, Midland's royal city. The Hawks, outfitted in clean formal attire instead of battered armor, were celebrated by cheering crowds lining the streets. The King of Midland himself bestowed upon Griffith the title of Count and granted him a sizable estate. The Hawks were no longer mere sellswords. They were the beloved White Hawk's victorious army, saviors of the kingdom. At a lavish banquet that night, Guts felt like a fish out of water. The grand ballroom was filled with noble lords and ladies in fine silk, chandeliers spilling warm light across polished marble floors. Griffith moved through the crowd with princely grace, conversing easily with ministers and even dancing with the king's daughter, Princess Charlotte. Casca, dressed in an elegant gown for the first time, looked as poised as any lady, though Guts could tell she was on guard, uncomfortable without a sword at her hip. Guts himself skulked near a pillar at the edge of the hall, tugging at the stiff collar of his formal doublet. He would have traded all the compliments and curious stares of nobility for a good night's sleep under the stars with his sword by his side. He realized, maybe for the first time, that this glamorous world was Griffith's element, not his. Sensing Guts's discomfort, Griffith later approached him on a balcony overlooking the city. In the cool night breeze, away from prying ears, the two talked quietly. Griffith, eyes shining with ambition, spoke of how this victory was just a step toward his dream, to attain a kingdom of his own. He thanked Guts for his invaluable role in achieving what they had so far. As Guts looked at Griffith, illuminated by moonlight, he felt a swell of pride in his friend's accomplishments, but also a pang of something else. A realization that Griffith's dream was vast and grand, while he himself had never really thought beyond swinging his sword for the Hawks. That night, after the banquet, the Hawks had their own private celebration outside the city walls, preferring the open air to stuffy courts. They gathered around a huge bonfire under a blanket of stars, passing around jugs of ale and telling war stories. Laughter echoed across the meadow as they reminisced about everything from silly camp pranks to the hardest battles. Casca, sitting by the fire's glow, looked around at her comrades, the only family she had ever known, and mused softly that their dreams and lives were like small flames, joining into one great blaze, a bonfire of dreams lighting up the dark. Guts, seated just at the edge of the firelight, overheard her words and glanced around at the band. He saw the animated faces of men and women who each carried their own hopes. Some talked about maybe buying a farm now that the war was over. Others fantasized about starting businesses or becoming knights in peacetime. Even Corcus joked about opening a tavern with his share of reward money. Each dream, each plan for the future, flickered like a candle in the night. Guts realized in that moment that nearly everyone in the Hawks was looking forward to something beyond the battlefield, something they wanted to achieve or return to. Everyone, perhaps, except him. For so long, Guts's purpose had been defined by surviving and fighting for the Band of the Hawk and for Griffith's cause. He had lived warmed by the fire of Griffith's dream, never questioning what his own dream might be. He remembered a conversation he had once overheard, Griffith speaking to Princess Charlotte on a balcony in the moonlight, not long before the Doldry campaign. Griffith had said that the only friends he could truly respect were those who had their own dreams, their own goals, equal to his. A true friend would never subordinate their dream to someone else's. They would fight beside Griffith as an equal, with a purpose of their own. Guts hadn't fully understood why those words unsettled him back then, but sitting by the bonfire now, he felt their weight. Did he have a purpose of his own? As the bonfire crackled and his comrades eventually drifted to sleep, one by one, Guts remained awake, staring into the dying embers. Across the way, he could see Griffith perched on a low hill, also awake, gazing at the distant horizon even in the dark, as if envisioning the kingdom he yearned to rule. Casca was curled up asleep, not far from him, exhausted from both battle and celebration. Guts's heart was conflicted. He admired Griffith deeply, and was grateful to him for giving him a place to belong. But a gnawing thought had taken root: to truly be Griffith's equal, to be considered a true friend in Griffith's own eyes, he would need to have something for himself, a calling or ambition that was his alone. That night, under an infinite sprawl of stars, Guts made a quiet decision. Now that the war was over and peace loomed, perhaps it was time for him to discover who he was outside of the Band of the Hawk. The idea of leaving the Hawks, leaving his friends, leaving Casca and Griffith, pained him more than any wound. But the notion of staying without growing, of forever being seen, at least in his mind, as someone living only for another man's dream, had become equally painful. Guts realized he needed to prove something to himself, that he could find or forge a purpose for his own life, a reason to wield his sword that wasn't just given to him by Griffith. With that resolve forming, Guts finally laid back on the cool grass. The silhouettes of his sleeping comrades around the dying fire reassured him for now. They were all still here, and nothing had changed yet. He closed his eyes and let the gentle summer night wash over him. Though uncertain about the path ahead, Guts felt oddly calm. He had faced literal armies without fear. Facing the unknown path of his own life was just another challenge. In the silence, he could almost hear the quiet crackle of the last embers as the bonfire of dreams smoldered. Surrounded by the people who had become his family, Guts drifted into sleep, determined to meet the dawn with a decision that would alter all of their fates. The long war was over, and peace had settled over Midland. But within the Band of the Hawk's camp, an uneasy quiet had taken hold in the early spring. Guts had been strangely distant since the victory at Doldry. He trained as hard as ever and fought off roaming bandits with the Hawks in post-war mop-up operations. But in the evenings he grew silent, contemplative. Casca noticed him climbing hills alone to watch sunsets, and Griffith too noted a change, a restlessness in Guts's eyes when he thought no one was looking. One crisp pre-dawn morning, when most of the camp still slept, Guts began to slip away. He had resolved to leave the band of the Hawk to discover his own path. He thought it best to depart quietly, without confrontation or drawn-out farewells that he wasn't sure how to give. With his few belongings strapped to his horse and his great sword on his back, Guts walked his steed through the mists beyond the edge of camp. His heart was heavy. Every step away from his sleeping comrades felt like lifting a weight that wanted to stay grounded. But he kept moving, telling himself this was necessary. However, before Guts could disappear into the morning haze, a voice rang out. "Where do you think you're going, Guts?" Startled, Guts turned to see Casca, hair tousled from sleep, standing a few paces behind him. She had awoken by chance and noticed his silhouette departing. Behind her, roused by the commotion, were Judo, Pippin, and a few others rubbing sleep from their eyes. Within moments the alarm spread. Captain Guts was leaving. Casca's eyes flashed with hurt and anger as she stomped toward him. "You're just going to abandon us? After everything?" she demanded in a fierce whisper, not wanting to wake the whole camp. Though by now many were stirring, Guts grimaced. He had hoped to avoid this very scene. In a low voice, he tried to explain that the war was won and he had things he needed to figure out for himself. Casca was not satisfied. To her it felt like betrayal. The Band of the Hawk was about to enter a new era of prestige, and she had counted on Guts to be by Griffith's side. By her side. How could he walk away so casually? Emotions she'd been holding back boiled up. Frustration, fear for the Hawk's future without him, and perhaps deepest of all the personal anguish of losing someone she had come to trust and care for. She struck Guts's chest with her fists, her voice cracking as she half shouted, "Why? Don't you owe Griffith more than this? Don't you owe us?" By now, the commotion had drawn nearly everyone from their tents. A circle formed at a respectful distance. The Hawks watched with a mix of confusion and sorrow. Some of the younger ones, like Rickard, looked as if their older brother were leaving home forever. Corcus wore a scowl of upset disbelief, muttering that he always knew that Lone Wolf would cut and run. Dudo hovered worriedly, prepared to intervene if things grew uglier between Casca and Guts. Guts gently caught Casca's wrists to stop her desperate hits. "Casca," he said quietly, "I'm thankful for everything. But I have to do this. I have to stand on my own." His words were simple, but in them Casca heard the firm resolve of a man who had already made up his mind. Before she could reply, another voice sliced through the cold morning air. "Is this about what I said that night?" Griffith stepped forward from the crowd, composed but deathly pale. He had heard the ruckus and come to investigate, only to catch enough of the exchange to understand. His eyes bore into Guts, with a mix of disbelief and a quickly masked desperation. "You're leaving to find your own dream, aren't you?" Griffith said softly, almost to himself. He remembered that fateful conversation he knew Guts had overheard, his definition of a true friend. Perhaps in inspiring Guts to seek his own purpose, he had unwittingly sown the seeds of this moment. Guts met Griffith's gaze. For a moment the world around them fell away. In Griffith's eyes, Guts saw a plea that said stay, and also a fierce pride that would never openly beg. In Guts's single nod of affirmation, Griffith saw the independent will he had always admired in Guts, now carrying him away. Griffith's heart clenched. The one person he had allowed into his inner circle as an equal was about to slip from his grasp. A tense silence gripped the camp. A few Hawks shifted uneasily, sensing the emotional gravity between their two leaders. Griffith, searching for words and failing to find any that could sway Guts with reason or sentiment, defaulted to the one language both men knew best. "The sword, if you want to go," Griffith said, voice wavering just a touch. "Then you'll have to fight me for it." A hush fell. Casca's breath caught. This was the very scenario she had dreaded. A duel between Griffith and Guts. Not in sport this time, but with Guts's departure, and perhaps Griffith's honor on the line. "Don't please," she whispered. But neither man seemed to hear her. Guts knew there was no avoiding this. Perhaps deep down, he even welcomed it. A chance to prove how far he sept come, and to sever his bond to Griffith cleanly. He stepped back and drew his sword. "Fine," he replied quietly. "One last time." The other hawks instinctively backed away, forming a wide ring on the dewy grass. The sun was just cresting the horizon, pink and orange washing over the sky. A cold breeze skittered across the field, carrying the scent of wet earth and early spring blossoms from distant trees. Guts and Griffith faced each other, as they had years ago when they first met. But so much had changed between them. Guts now stood as Griffith's greatest warrior and would-be friend. Griffith stood as a celebrated commander, whose dream was now tantalizingly within reach. Griffith did not remove his cloak or tunic. He wore no armor aside from a dress rapier at his side. He hadn't expected to battle, and was not outfitted for a protracted fight. Guts, by contrast, was in his full gear, having prepared to travel. Yet, Griffith's determination to stop Guts was absolute. Casca could see it in his eyes. Griffith felt he needed Guts, or perhaps more accurately, he could not bear the idea of Guts walking a path separate from his own. Without further ceremony, Guts raised his enormous sword, and Griffith drew his slender blade. The air between them was taut. For a few heartbeats, they just stared. Memories of countless fights, shoulder to shoulder, flashing through their minds. Then Griffith moved, lunging in with a speed honed by countless duels. He aimed not to kill, but to disable. A strike toward Guts's sword-arm shoulder. But Guts had anticipated such a tactic. In a split-second burst of motion, he swung his heavy blade, not at Griffith himself, but at Griffith's sword. Steel met steel in a single thunderous clash. Guts's stroke, fueled by all his strength and emotion, shattered Griffith's delicate rapier upon impact. The slim blade broke apart with a loud crack, the tip flying off and landing yards away in the grass. At the same time, Guts halted his swing, stopping his great sword an inch from Griffith's collarbone. In that frozen moment, the duel was decided almost as soon as it began. Griffith's eyes widened in shock as he realized he was holding nothing but the hilt of a broken sword. He hadn't even fully registered the blow when he felt Guts's blade hovering near his throat. A thin line of blood appeared on Griffith's neck, where a fragment of his own shattered sword or the brush of Guts's blade had nicked him. Time seemed to stop. The gathered hawks were stunned into silence. Some hardly saw what had happened. It was so quick. Guts slowly lowered his sword. He had restrained himself from harming Griffith, but the symbolic impact was clear. Guts had won. He stepped past Griffith, who remained motionless, his eyes downcast at the pieces of his sword on the ground. Casca rushed to Griffith's side, asking if he was hurt, but Griffith did not respond. He simply sank to his knees, still staring at the broken blade in his hand, as if trying to comprehend how his world had abruptly changed. For Griffith, that moment was earth-shattering. Never had he imagined Guts would actually defeat him and walk away. The charismatic, unflappable leader was, for once, utterly at a loss. In Griffith's mind echoed a terrifying thought. Is he truly leaving me? He had always believed Guts would fight for his dream until the end. Now that anchor was gone. The sight of Guts's back as he began to walk away felt like a dagger twisting in Griffith's chest. Guts paused a few steps beyond and turned his head back slightly. He wanted to say something, to thank Griffith, perhaps, or to apologize for the pain he was causing, but no words came. Instead, he offered the hawks a parting look. Judo gave him a sad, understanding nod. Pippin raised a hand in a gentle farewell. Rickert was openly weeping, hiccuping Guts's name. Corcus folded his arms tight, refusing to meet Guts's gaze, too proud to cry, but clearly hurt. Casca was knelt beside Griffith, her face a portrait of heartbreak and anger. She couldn't even look at Guts, her eyes fixed on Griffith's slumped form. With a deep breath and a final lingering look at the only family he had ever known, Guts resumed walking. He left the band of the Hawks camp and stepped into the morning light, alone once more. In the weeks that followed, the band of the Hawk carried on, but a palpable absence hung over them. Guts' departure left a wound in their ranks that only time might heal. Griffith, especially, was profoundly affected. He masked it publicly, continuing to attend royal functions, strategizing how to secure a future for the Hawks in peacetime. But those closest to him, Casca and Judo, noticed a hollowness in his once bright eyes. Griffith spent hours in thought by himself, replaying that morning again and again. He questioned if he had done something wrong, if he had misjudged Guts's heart, and deeper, unacknowledged in the pit of his soul, festered a sense of betrayal and hurt pride. The one person he thought might always be at his side had left of his own will. One warm summer night, not long after Guts's leaving, Griffith, unable to sleep, rode to Princess Charlotte's palace residence for solace. What transpired was a tragic lapse in Griffith's normally impeccable judgment. In a moment of emotional vulnerability and impulsive yearning for comfort, he climbed into Charlotte's tower, a reckless, forbidden act. Charlotte welcomed him with innocent love, and in that comfort, Griffith sought distraction from his inner turmoil. They spent the night together, a union of solace for Griffith, but a dire breach of social and political bounds. Come morning, the consequences hit with brutal swiftness. The king's guards burst in, catching Griffith in the princess's bedchamber. Griffith was arrested on the spot. For seducing the king's beloved daughter, he was charged with high treason. All the favor and goodwill he had earned evaporated in an instant. The king, overcome with fury and a twisted envy, for it was whispered he harbored unhealthy affections for his own daughter, ordered Griffith thrown into the deepest, most miserable dungeon imaginable, the Tower of Rebirth. There, shackled and isolated, Griffith was placed at the mercy of an unspeakably cruel torturer instructed to keep him alive, but only barely. News of Griffith's fall from grace struck the band of the Hawk like a lightning bolt. Overnight, they went from heroes to hunted outlaws. The Midland army turned on them. Their camp was attacked, and they barely escaped. Casca, grieving and suddenly forced into leadership, gathered the remnants of the Hawks and led them into hiding in the countryside. What once was a proud mercenary band became a scattered group of fugitives. By day they concealed themselves in forests and caves. By night they moved, seeking safety and hoping beyond hope to somehow rescue Griffith. Casca took on the heavy mantle of command with grim resolve. She kept the Hawks together through that terrible year after Guts's departure and Griffith's imprisonment. But every night, when she was alone under the weight of the dark, her heart ached with loss. She lost her beloved Griffith to fate's cruel turn, and she lost Guts by his own choice. Often she would climb a hill in the moonlight and look out, wondering if somewhere Guts was looking at the same moon, and if he regretted leaving. Sometimes she quietly cursed him for not being there when they needed him most. During this time, Guts was far away, walking his solitary path. He had left to find purpose, but what he found initially was something else entirely, a nightmare that would eclipse even the darkest of his past experiences. Late one hot summer afternoon, roughly a year after Guts's departure from the Hawks, the sun began to wane in an eerie and unnatural way. Guts was far from any city, riding through quiet hills in search of rumors he'd heard about the remnants of the band of the Hawk being in danger. Ever since leaving, his heart had been uneasy, pulling him back toward his former comrades, in spite of the distance he tried to put. He had learned through sketchy tavern gossip that the Hawks were declared outlaws and Griffith had vanished from public view. Concern and guilt gnawed at Guts, driving him to find them. That day, as the sun hung low and red in the sky, Guts's brand, a strange mark on the back of his neck that had appeared after his time with the Hawks. He never fully understood its origin, only that it ached in the presence of evil, began to bleed and throb fiercely. He winced, sensing danger nearby, perhaps an apostle, one of the powerful demons in human guise he had been hunting. The winds died and unnatural stillness fell. As Guts crested a hill, leading his horse on foot, he noticed the sun was no longer shining normally. A black disk was inching over it, turning the daylight into a dim, rusty twilight. A solar eclipse, but none had been expected. The sky itself felt ominous and wrong. His horse whinnied nervously and refused to go further. Guts felt the hairs on his arms rise. The brand on his neck was now pouring blood. Something terrible was imminent. Suddenly, Guts heard a sound that made his heart drop. A chorus of horrified, distant screams carried on the breeze. He recognized some of those voices even at distance. Corcus, Pippin, Casca. They were coming from a small valley just ahead, shrouded in shadow. Guts broke into a run, abandoning his horse, panic rising in his throat. He charged down into the valley, which seemed unnaturally dark, as if dusk had fallen prematurely. The sight that greeted him was beyond imagining. The band of the Hawk. What remained of them were trapped in a surreal nightmare made flesh. All around were twisted, monstrous creatures feasting and ripping through human bodies. The terrain itself had changed. Instead of grassy hills, there was a vast expanse that looked like a sea of flesh and faces stretching under a swirling, bloody sky. Towering in the distance were four gigantic, otherworldly figures, observing with cruel detachment the God Hand, though Guts did not yet fully know who they were. In the midst of this hellscape, Guts's comrades were being slaughtered. Pippin, ever brave, was swinging his huge mace, trying to fend off a horde of chittering amorphous demons to protect a wounded Judo and Casca, who was clutching a dull sword and wearing only tattered remnants of clothing and armor. Corcus was nearby, screaming in defiance, as he was overtaken by grotesque, blob-like monstrosities that pulled him down. One by one, Hawk's soldiers were falling, their bodies torn apart or consumed by the swarming horrors. Guts's mind could barely process the horror, but instinct and love for his friends propelled him forward. With an enraged howl, he leapt into the fray, Dragon Slayer, his massive sword cleaving a demonic creature clean in half. He hacked his way to Casca's side. She was alive, but in shock, trying to fend off a leech-like demon that had latched onto her arm. Guts smashed it off her with a swing. "Casca," he shouted, eyes wild. She turned to him, her face streaked with blood and tears, recognition sparking. "Guts," she managed to choke out, relief and anguish flooding her voice. But there was no time for reunion. A gigantic, deformed monstrosity lunged toward them, a hulking thing like a grotesque ox, fused with a lizard. Guts pushed Casca behind him and met the beast's charge head-on, plunging his sword through its gaping maw. It writhed, nearly bowling him over, but he held firm even as acidic saliva hissed on his gauntlet. Pippin came up with a roar, smashing the creature's skull with his warhammer. For a fleeting moment, Guts managed a nod of gratitude to Pippin. They fought back to back like old times. Amidst the chaos, Guts desperately scanned for Griffith. Griffith was nowhere to be seen among the living Hawks. Instead, Guts's gaze was drawn upward, to the God Hand, those 5 enormous eldritch apparitions in the air. 4 of them encircled a 5th, smaller figure, who hovered at their center, being reborn from a swirling mass of blood and darkness. As lightning crackled across the crimson sky, Guts caught a glimpse. Emerging from that cocoon of shadow was Griffith, or something that bore Griffith's face. But he was changed, adorned in slick black demonic armor, with a malevolent calm radiating from him. In that instant, Guts realized with horror what had transpired. Griffith had sacrificed the Hawks, his own comrades, in a dark ritual, and in return he was reborn as one of those archdemons, a member of the God Hand. The weight of betrayal and despair nearly buckled Guts's knees, but Casca's scream snapped him back to the present carnage. A new terror now descended. Femto. The name the demons howled in reverence for the reborn Griffith, swept down from the sky with his raven-black wings. The monstrous horde drew back momentarily, as if to make room for their new lord. Femto hovered above Guts, Casca, and the ragged cluster of surviving Hawks, which by now was only Casca, Guts, Pippin, Judo, and Rickert, who had been knocked out early and was lying aside mercifully unconscious. Guts looked up into the face of the man he had called friend. "Griffith," he cried out, voice breaking, half plea, half fury. There was no reply, only a cold, curious gaze from those inhuman eyes. Femto's presence pressed down like a tangible weight of dread. In a swift motion faster than sight, he seized Casca from behind Guts. One moment, Casca was at Guts's back. The next, she was yanked into the air, held in Femto's unnatural grasp. For an awful second, Casca was too shocked even to struggle. She looked into the face of what used to be Griffith, and saw not a shred of the man she knew. Guts roared and leaped, swinging his sword in a desperate arc to cut Femto down and free Casca. But Femto was beyond mortal reach. With a slight flap of his dark wings, he ascended just out of Guts's range. Guts's sword whooshed through empty air. Guts's sword whooshed through empty air. And then it happened, an act so cruel and surreal that Guts's mind nearly shattered at the sight. Femto began to violate Casca in front of Guts's very eyes, in a grotesque parody of intimacy, fueled by malice. Casca's scream of terror and pain rang out, snapping the silence that had fallen. Guts's world went red. He howled in rage, swinging again and again at anything, everything trying to reach her. But lesser demons swarmed him, restraining his arms and legs with superhuman strength. Guts fought like a trapped wolf, muscles bulging, veins standing out in his neck as he struggled. Pippin, gravely injured, mustered his last strength to try and wade into the demons holding Guts, but a giant toothed maw closed over Pippin's shoulder, pulling him down. Judo, bleeding from multiple wounds, threw his last throwing knives at the demons around Casca, but one knife grazed Femto's helmet harmlessly, and Judo was impaled from behind by a mantis-like creature's spiked limb. One by one, every friend Guts had left was cut down, until only he and Casca remained in this living nightmare. Casca in Femto's clutches, and Guts pinned by writhing demon flesh. Tears of helpless fury streamed from Guts's one open eye. The other was squeezed shut in agony as a demon's talon had slashed across his face, destroying it. He couldn't even form words, just raw, animalistic screams. The brand on his neck burned a searing hot, marking him as a sacrifice and drawing more evil to him. In sheer desperation, Guts did the unthinkable. He began hacking off his own left arm, which was trapped in a demon's jaw, using the broken remnants of a dagger that lay nearby. With each saw of the blade against his flesh, pain nearly made him black out. But he kept going, fueled by the single-minded need to reach Casca, to save her, to do something. Blood spurted, and Guts howled through clenched teeth, and finally his arms severed at the elbow. The demons holding him faltered in surprise as the man they thought subdued was suddenly free, albeit at a terrible cost to himself. Half-blind, one-armed, and drenched in blood, Guts lunged forward through sheer willpower. He stumbled and crawled toward the floating figure of Femto, who still had Casca pressed beneath him. Femto looked down at Guts's pitiful approach, perhaps with a detached curiosity, perhaps with no emotion at all. Guts extended his remaining arm, fingers outstretched, as if by reaching he could claw into this nightmare and pull Casca to safety. Gra, ahh. The sound that ripped from Guts's throat was unlike any human cry. It was pure agony, rage, heartbreak, and love all woven together. Just as Femto's atrocity reached its peak, and Guts's sanity was on the verge of collapse, a massive fracture tore through the astral space. Time seemed to slow. The sky literally cracked. Through that rift, like a lightning bolt from heaven, charged a tall figure on horseback, Skull Knight, clad in ominous black armor with a skull motif. This enigmatic ally, whom Guts had met once before, burst into the Eclipse realm with one purpose: to save the last two branded ones, Guts and Casca. With swift, relentless strikes from his ornate sword, Skull Knight scattered the lesser demons around Guts like leaves in a storm. Then, with a fearless gallop, he lunged directly at Femto, caught off guard. Femto released Casca, who fell limp and unconscious from his grasp. In the same breath, Skull Knight snatched her falling form and scooped Guts up by the back of his torn tunic, throwing both Guts and Casca over his steed's hindquarters. The God Hand, those four other abyssal lords, reacted with surprise and anger. The very air quaked as reality began reasserting itself. Skull Knight had forced open an escape route from this demon dimension. A vortex of swirling darkness and light enveloped the knight and the two survivors. With a final hateful glare, Femto Griffith locked eyes with Guts as the knight's horse leapt through the portal. Then, in an implosion of wind and pressure, the Eclipse dimension collapsed behind them, severing the ritual. Silence. Night. Crickets chirping softly. Guts awoke under a vast open sky, littered with cold stars. He was sprawled on the grass of that quiet hill where just moments, or was it hours ago, nothing had been out of the ordinary. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of dew and smoke from distant campfires. For a moment Guts thought it had all been a fever dream, but the searing pain in his left side, the sticky wetness of blood all over him, and the raw devastation in his soul told him it had been horrifically real. Nearby, Casca lay unconscious but breathing, alive and back in the physical world. However, as Guts crawled weakly to her, he noticed her eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. He spoke her name softly. She did not respond or even blink. It was as if her mind had retreated behind an unbreakable wall to escape the trauma. Guts touched her shoulder gently, and she flinched like a fearful animal, a whimper escaping her lips. He realized with dawning sorrow that the strong, fiery Casca he knew was gone, her psyche shattered by the unspeakable violence done to her. The rest of the hawks were nowhere to be seen. All those taken into the Eclipse had been consumed, their bodies now strewn about the hilltop as soulless corpses, branded with the same mark Guts bore. Guts, shaking, gathered Casca into his one remaining arm and clutched her to his chest. Her body was limp and unresponsive, like a doll. He looked around at the carnage of what had been his family. Pippin's massive form lay still, eyes open to the stars. Judo's body was draped protectively over the small form of Rickert, who by some twist of fate had been outside the Eclipse's main carnage and was just now stirring awake, confused and horrified. A choking sound rose from Guts's throat, half sob, half primal scream. Everything was lost. His comrades slaughtered to the last save two. The friend he admired and followed, Griffith, had become a monstrous betrayer. The woman he loved, for he now understood that he did love Casca, was alive but broken to a childlike state, her spirit all but destroyed, and his own body was maimed nearly beyond use. He was missing an eye and an arm, and the brand on his neck was now a curse that would draw hateful spirits to him forevermore. Overwhelmed by grief, Guts tipped his head back and let out a wail that echoed across the empty hills. It was the cry of a man who had lost everything, a howl that pierced the veil between worlds. In the distance, wolves howled in answer, or perhaps in mourning. Yet even in that abyss of despair, some small ember of defiance refused to die in Guts. Through ragged breaths and tears, he vowed in his heart that he would make them pay. The God Hand, the Apostles, and above all, Griffith Femto. No matter what it took, no matter what he had to sacrifice of himself, he would hunt them down and avenge the Hawks and Casca's honor. This oath crystallized inside him, with white-hot intensity, merging with his agony to become something harder than steel. As dawn broke pale and cold, Guts sat beneath the lonely tree on that hill, Casca wrapped in his cloak beside him, and watched the sunrise with his remaining eye. The gentle light revealed the horrible truth all around. Scattered weapons, pools of blood, lifeless hands reaching toward nothing. But it also illuminated Guts's face, showing not only tears but a fierce, unyielding glare. Guts had survived the eclipse, scarred, yes, traumatized beyond words, yes, but alive, and as long as he lived, he would not let that night be the end of his story. In that sunrise, a new Guts was born from the ashes of the band of the Hawk. Not Guts the comrade, or Guts the mercenary, but Guts the Black Swordsman, a solitary figure now driven by an all-consuming purpose, revenge against the forces of darkness that had taken everything from him. The brand on his neck bled anew in the presence of the rising sun, for even daylight was now pain to the branded, and Guts pressed a hand to it, swearing through gritted teeth, "I'll kill them, every last one." Thus ended the golden chapter of Guts's life, and began a long night of struggle that would test him beyond human limits. In the wake of the eclipse, Guts and Casca were rescued from that accursed hill by the only other survivor of the Hawks, the young Rickert, along with the enigmatic Skull Knight. Rickert, who had been spared the horrors of the eclipse by staying behind, stumbled upon the blood-soaked hill at dawn. Stricken with grief and disbelief, he found Guts half dead and cradling a mute, catatonic Casca. With the Skull Knight's guidance, they brought the two to the only sanctuary they could, the secluded mountain workshop of Godot, an old hermit blacksmith who had been a friend and supplier to the Hawks. In Godot's humble cave home, beneath the soothing glow of forge embers, Guts's broken body was tended and his feverish ravings soothed. Days passed in a haze for Guts, but under Godot's gruff care, he eventually stabilized. When he finally awoke properly, it was to the gentle sound of a hammer on steel, and the earthy smell of coal and metal. His wounds had been bound. In place of his left forearm was only a bandaged stump. A leather patch covered his lost right eye. The new reality of his injuries settled heavily on him, but even heavier was the emotional weight. Guts immediately asked for Casca. Rickert led him to a corner of the cave where Casca sat quietly, dressed in a simple robe. She did not look up as Guts approached. He spoke her name softly. She only flinched, eyes unfocused. With infinite care, Guts knelt in front of her and tried to meet her gaze. Casca peered at him with the guarded, innocent confusion of a small child looking at a stranger. When he gently reached a hand toward her, she scrambled back against the wall, whimpering in fear. Guts's heart cracked. Casca, once proud and fearless, was now mentally like a frightened child, unable to recognize even him. The trauma of the eclipse had robbed her of her sanity and memories. That night, Guts left Godot's cave to stand outside under the stars. The mountain air was cold. It helped numb the pain inside just a little. As he gazed at the vast dark sky, memories of the band of the Hawk flooded him. Laughing with Judo, sparring with Pippin, listening to one of Corcus's tall tales, and Griffith smiling that day they met by the river. Each recollection was a dagger of grief. Guts found himself trembling, fists clenched. Why was he alive when all of them were gone? Why had he been spared? The brand on his neck throbbed then, sensing his sorrow, or perhaps attracting something in the night. Wisps of malevolent spirits began to coalesce around the cave's clearing, twisted ghostly forms drawn to the brands he and Casca bore. With Godot's home threatened, Guts' sorrow ignited into fury. He seized a discarded sword from Godot's outdoor workbench, an unfinished blade, heavy and crude but serviceable, and tore into the apparitions. The ghosts wailed and lunged. Guts slashed and roared, driven by a newfound hatred. These spirits of darkness, these minions of the God Hand, were now his eternal enemies. That night he fought until the first light of dawn, slaying or driving off all the evil shades that came for them. Panting and drenched in cold sweat, he realized that this would be his life now. Branded by sacrifice, he and Casca would be hunted by demons each time night fell. There would be no peace, no simple quiet existence. As days went on, Guts recovered strength, but with each passing day a restless fire grew in him. Godot fashioned him a custom mechanical arm prosthetic to replace his missing left arm, an ingenious device of steel and leather that could grip a sword and even conceal a small cannon within for a surprise blast. Guts learned to use it quickly, practicing by crushing rocks and even aiming the cannon at tree stumps outside the cave. He was driven, almost manic, pushing his body to adapt despite the missing limbs and eye. All the while, Casca remained childlike and afraid, requiring constant gentle care. Rickard and Godot's granddaughter, Erica, tended to her, feeding and dressing her as needed. Farnese and the Hawks were gone. It fell to this unlikely little household to care for the broken hero and his love. Seeing Casca so vulnerable tugged at something deep in Guts. He felt responsible. He had failed to protect her. And now, though he loved her dearly, he could not even communicate with her. To Casca's traumatized mind, Guts' presence itself, with his angry voice and violent aura, was frightening. He would try to approach tenderly, but often she would shrink away or begin to cry, and Guts would retreat, heart heavy. One evening, Guts woke from a nightmare of the eclipse to find himself standing over Casca's bed, his hands around her neck. He had nearly strangled her in his sleepwalking state, driven by a horrific flashback where he mistook her for an enemy. He recoiled in horror at himself as Casca cowered in a corner, sobbing. That incident shook Guts to his core. He realized that as long as he was consumed by rage and haunted by evil, even those he loved were not safe around him. The next morning, Guts made a fateful decision. He couldn't just stay here and let things be. The desire for vengeance and the torment of nightly attacks were driving him mad. Casca needed calm and safety, and in his current state, he felt he could provide neither. God confronted him as he prepared to depart. The old blacksmith, with sorrow in his wise eyes, urged Guts to reconsider. Revenge won't bring you peace, boy. It's like chasing the wind. But Guts was resolute. He strapped on a suit of matte black armor God had pieced together for him, his new Black Swordsman attire, and took up Dragon Slayer, an enormous slab-like sword God had forged long ago as a king's fancy, a blade meant to slay a dragon, too heavy and unwieldy for any normal man. This massive weapon had hung unused in Godhat's storage for years. Guts hefted it with one arm. It was unbelievably heavy, but something in him resonated with that weight. It matched the weight of his rage. "This will do," Guts said, determination burning in his remaining eye. He left Casca in Rickard and Godot's care. It was the hardest parting of all. Casca seemed oblivious, as Guts gently draped a cloak around her shoulders and whispered, "Stay safe. I'll make the world safer for you." She only stared at a dust mote floating by, humming softly to herself. With a deep breath, Guts turned and walked away, not looking back. He knew if he did, he might never find the strength to go. Thus Guts set off alone into the world once more, this time not as a wandering mercenary, but as a hunter on a dark quest. Word eventually spread through taverns and villages of a grim figure, clad in a black cape and armor, wielding a sword far too big to be real, who wandered from place to place killing monsters. They called him the Black Swordsman. Many who encountered him weren't sure if he was human or some vengeful ghost. In those early years of his solitary journey, Guts was driven almost purely by wrath and pain. Every night, as expected, evil spirits beset him. Drawn to the brand on his neck, Guts fought them without mercy. In truth, a part of him welcomed these nightly battles. They were an outlet for the fury that otherwise would have consumed him from within. He slept only in brief snatches, often at dawn, exhausted after slaying whatever had come for him in the darkness. His eyes grew colder, his demeanor harsher. To villagers he saved, he seemed intimidating and distant. To those he interrogated for info on demons, he could appear outright terrifying. And yet, ironically, it was during one of these brutal hunts that Guts found a new glimmer of human connection to prevent him from losing himself entirely. In a dingy tavern one afternoon, he saved a small cheerful elf named Puck from abuse by some thugs. Puck was a tiny, glowing winged sprite, playful, compassionate, and innocent. Initially, Guts kept Puck at arm's length, gruffly telling the elf to get lost. But Puck, out of gratitude and curiosity, followed Guts. Over time, Puck proved useful. His dust-like elf powder could soothe wounds, and his very presence provided a light of levity and conscience in Guts's dark world. Guts often barked at Puck, or acted indifferent, but in truth, Puck's joking and concern began to chip away at the wall around Guts's heart. On lonely evenings, when campfire shadows played tricks on Guts's mind and ghosts of memory visited, Puck's gentle chatter or simple questions sometimes grounded him. Puck would ask things like, "Do you miss your friends?" or "Why do you keep fighting?" Queries Guts normally wouldn't tolerate, but somehow, coming from a guileless elf, he occasionally answered in rare vulnerable moments. As the Black Swordsman, Guts carved a bloody path through any powerful demons in human disguise he could find. He slew an enormous serpent man, who terrorized a town, then a slithering count who devoured heretics under the guise of a pious ruler. This latter confrontation was especially perilous. The count, upon defeat, attempted to sacrifice his young daughter to invoke the god hand and save himself. Guts, battered and near his limits from the fight, witnessed the god hand manifest in a vortex of reality, including the archdemon Femto Griffith. Enraged beyond reason at the sight of his once friend turned monster, Guts tried futilely to attack the untouchable apparitions, screaming curses. The god hand merely taunted him, as the count was dragged to hell for failing to perform the sacrifice. In that encounter's wake, Guts was left shaken. It was a stark reminder of how far beyond reach his ultimate targets were. Only by becoming stronger, far stronger than any mortal, could he ever hope to confront them. And so his resolve deepened. Guts trained relentlessly when not fighting. He pushed his body's endurance, swung his massive sword until even his iron prosthetic felt strain, and tested the tricks in his arsenal, throwing knives, the cannon arm, repeater crossbow he'd rigged onto his arm. Battle after battle hardened him further. Villagers he saved sometimes tried to thank him, but he seldom lingered. A brief nod, maybe a gruff warning, "Stay inside at night, the devils come then," and he would move on. He feared making any attachments that could be used against him, and moreover, he feared the beast of darkness inside him, a growing shadow in his soul that whispered bloodthirsty thoughts. That inner beast wanted not just justice, but mindless slaughter, and Guts fought to keep it at bay, clinging to threads of humanity largely embodied by Casca's memory and Puck's friendship. 2 years of this solitary hell passed. Guts had by then killed numerous apostles and become a terror to evildoers. But in quiet moments, beneath the rage, he felt a gnawing guilt, and worry about Casca. He left her in safety, yes. But was she okay? Did she hate him for leaving? One night, as he struggled to sleep on a grassy knoll after killing a monstrous rosary of tortured souls, once a deacon corrupted by a behelit, he dreamed of Casca's gentle smile as it once was, and of her reaching out to him. He awoke with tears in his eye and a name on his lips. He realized that all his vengeance would be hollow if he lost the very reason he fought, to protect Casca, and perhaps give her a life free of fear. As fate would have it, around that time, trouble was brewing that drew Guts back toward Casca's vicinity. Word reached him through a network of informants, and a mysterious prophecy delivered by the Skull Knight in one of their terse meetings, that Casca had gone missing from Godot's sanctuary. The girl in her broken mind had wandered off one day and vanished. When Guts heard this, a pang of panic and responsibility hit him. Dropping all else, he raced back toward Midland in search of her. The flames of vengeance in him were now matched by a flame of worry for Casca's safety. His search led him to the plague-stricken refuge known as St. Albian, where a great tower of conviction stood amid a sea of desperate refugees. Guts arrived in Albion to find a situation as dire as any battlefield. The land was rife with pestilence and fanaticism. Casca, known only as a nameless, seemingly mute wanderer, had been captured by a zealous religious order, the Holy Iron Chain Knights, led by a young noblewoman named Lady Farnese. Farnese was devout, troubled, and fervent in her mission to punish heretics. Casca, found with the mark of the witch her brand and exhibiting strange phenomena, for evil spirits dogged her at night, had been deemed a witch to be burned. Guts cut through hordes of restless undead that swarmed the refugee camp in Albion's outskirts as the night of conviction, a prophesied eclipse-like event, neared. In doing so, he crossed paths with Farnese and her loyal knight Serpico multiple times. Farnese became both fearful and fixated on Guts. This Black Swordsman challenged everything she believed, as he fought demons, which her faith had not prepared her to accept as real, and moved with a willpower she lacked. After Guts saved her from a demon-possessed horse, and, in a fit of vengeance, spanked and humiliated her, showing her the weakness of her faith against true darkness, Farnese's rigid world cracked. Serpico, Farnese's clever and gentle attendant and half-brother in secret, also took note of Guts's formidable might and began to respect him, even as an adversary. Amidst this chaos, Guts finally reached the top of the Tower of Conviction, where Casca was about to be burned at the stake by the fanatical Inquisitor Mazgus and his grotesque henchmen. In a dramatic showdown, Guts burst into the scene just as flames were licking at Casca's feet. With relentless fury, he battled Mazgus's deformed angels, men turned monster by torture and blind faith, cutting through them one by one. Mazgus himself transformed, by the power of a hidden behelit, into a hulking pseudo-apostle, a living idol of wrathful judgment, with feathered wings and fire-spewing prayers. But even this holy monster was no match for Guts's determination. In a desperate duel on the tower's peak, as dawn neared, Guts, with the help of a timely intervention by Puck and a small band of allies he gathered, including a resourceful former prostitute named Luca, who had cared for Casca, managed to strike Mazgus down, shattering his stone-like body and saving Casca from immolation. As Mazgus fell, the Tower of Conviction began to crumble. Beneath it, an evil phenomenon reached its climax, an incarnation ceremony triggered by the tortured life of an apostle known as the Egg of the Perfect World. In a moment that mirrored the eclipse 2 years prior, Griffith was reborn into the physical world, not as Femto in demon form, but in a new corporeal body, free of his torture-induced deformities. Guts saw, from the corner of his eye, a figure of a young man with silver hair standing on the tower for an instant. Bathed in moonlight, Griffith restored. His heart clenched with confusion and anger, but Casca's safety took priority. The tower collapsed entirely, sending everyone plummeting. Incredibly, they survived the fall, landing in a marsh of soft, otherworldly flesh and blood, the remnants of the aborted ceremony. When Guts regained his senses, Griffith was gone into the night, and Casca was in his arms, alive and physically unharmed. With Mazgus's fanatic reign over and dawn breaking, the few holy iron chain knights left simply watched in dazed silence, as Guts emerged from the rubble carrying Casca, Farnese, shaken to her core by the supernatural horrors she had witnessed, dropped to her knees and relinquished her authority. In that decisive moment, Farnese and Serpico made a life-altering choice. They left behind their old order and followed Guts. Farnese, feeling lost, but seeing how Guts protected Casca, offered her service to help Casca in any way she could, perhaps seeking redemption. Serpico, devoted to Farnese, and also quietly grateful to Guts for saving them all, pledged his sword as well, albeit with wary eyes and many unspoken reservations. Thus, Guts's solitary journey evolved into something new. He now traveled with a small party. There was Puck, ever-loyal tiny elf. Casca, whose care was paramount, and who had to be watched constantly to keep her from harm and from harming herself. Farnese, the former noble knight, turned Casca's self-appointed guardian, fumbling to learn basic chores and compassion. Serpico, resourceful and keen, who protected Farnese and learned to fight alongside Guts even as he harbored complicated feelings toward him. And later Isidro, a spirited thief boy who tagged along, aspiring to become a warrior like Guts. After Albian, Guts had a new goal, not only revenge, but also finding a way to restore Casca's mind. Puck spoke of Elfhelm, the land of the elves far across the sea, where the elf king might have the power to heal a shattered mind. That became the beacon for their ragtag group. So they began a long, perilous journey westward toward the sea, planning to sail to the distant island of Skellig, where Elfhelm was said to lie. The path was far from easy. Every step of the way, Guts's band was pursued by malicious spirits and apostles, drawn by the brands on Guts and Casca. Guts bore the brunt of nightly attacks, now aided thankfully by his companions. Farnese, who once cowered from even the idea of demons, forced herself to be brave. She would hold Casca tightly during night assaults, shielding her eyes from horror, or trace protective holy symbols, a skill she retained from her faith in the air to ward off weaker spirits. Serpico cleverly used the terrain, and a slender sword Guts forged for him to assist in dispatching smaller demonic creatures. Isidro proved bold and quick, scampering around tossing lit torches or firing a sling to distract enemies. And always Puck's dust healed wounds and his jokes eased tense hearts after the battle. Along their trek, they happened upon a tranquil, enchanted forest, home to an ancient witch named Flora. Flora's kind demeanor and immense wisdom offered the weary travelers a much-needed respite. She welcomed them into her magically protected mansion, where for the first time in ages, Guts and his friends spent a night free from demonic harassment, as evil could not penetrate Flora's wards. In the morning, Flora introduced them to her young apprentice, Shirke, a petite, green-haired girl, just a child but a talented witch in training. Shirke was initially shy and disdainful toward the rowdy, non-magical visitors, but her courtesy toward Flora kept her polite. Flora gently suggested that Shirke might accompany Guts's group to aid them. The world was changing, and Guts's cause to see Casca healed and to resist the encroaching horrors was important. Their stay was cut short when news came of a nearby village being attacked by trolls, vile goblin-like creatures from the astral world now manifesting and raiding humans due to the weakened barrier between realms, a consequence of Griffith's incarnation event. Shirke, with Flora's encouragement, agreed to guide Guts and company to the village to fend off the trolls. This mission turned into an adventure that forged strong bonds in the village of Enoch. Guts and Serpico battled dozens of loathsome trolls. Isidro saved children from their clutches. Farnese overcame terror to protect Casca, and even wielded a torch to keep trolls at bay. And Shirka, to everyone's awe, called upon powerful spirit magic, an army of ethereal wolves and floodwaters of the local river deity, to sweep the trolls away. Working together, they saved many villagers from a terrible fate, and Farnese in particular found a new sense of purpose, caring for Casca and helping Shirka with rituals. The villagers, grateful but frightened of the uncanny forces at play, bid them thanks as they left. After the battle, Shirka became more warmly regarded by the group. The wise beyond her years girl also grew fond of these bizarre, earnest adults, and one boy, who despite bickering, clearly cared for one another. Most of all, Shirka was moved by Guts's unwavering dedication to Casca, and by the darkness he struggled with internally. When Shirka first witnessed Guts succumb to the beast of darkness during a particularly dire moment, his rage had boiled over, nearly causing him to harm Casca in the fray. She used her magic to enter his psyche and calm the monstrous ego, preventing him from losing himself. That act created a special, almost familial bond between Guts and the young witch. She became one of the few who could literally reach into his darkness and pull him back to sanity with gentle thoughts of Casca or reminders of his humanity. However, safety was fleeting. Soon after, Flora's woodland mansion came under attack by minions of Griffith's new band of the Hawk, now comprising apostles. Flora, anticipating her end, entrusted the berserker armor to Guts, a cursed suit of ebony armor that grants its wearer immense strength and ferocity at the cost of devouring their senses and sanity. With no other choice, as a mighty apostle General Grunbeld, a dragon knight, bore down on them. Guts donned the berserker armor. The transformation was frightening. Spikes pierced into his flesh, and a helm shaped like a wolf's skull clamped over his face. He became a whirlwind of destruction, matching Grunbeld blow for blow, pushing the giant apostle back and astonishing all onlookers, friend and foe alike, with his savage power. But the armor took its toll. Guts felt nothing. Not the breaking of his bones or the tearing of his muscles. He fought far past the limits of normal pain, body moving like a possessed demon. Shirka, seeing Guts being consumed by the armor's frenzy, his astral form taking on the image of a ravenous black beast, intervened by diving into his spirit and calling him back with the vision of Casca and the voices of his companions. Through her desperate effort, Guts regained a sliver of control and managed to direct the armor's power without losing himself completely. In the end, Flora sacrificed herself, using the last of her magic to hold off the apostles. Guts's party could escape her burning home. As they fled, Flora's spirit, like a great tree of light, crumbled, and with it the forest's protection. It was a bittersweet departure. They had lost a mentor, but they gained a new strength and new allies. Shirka and her familiar, an elf named Ivilera, officially joined their journey. Guts now bore the berserker armor, a fearsome edge in the battles to come, though every use threatened to cost him parts of himself, sight, feeling, or worse, his very soul. Now, with Shirka's guidance and Farnese's nurturing support of Casca, the group pressed onward to the Western Sea. They traveled through war-torn lands where Griffith's new nation, Falconia, was making itself known, gathering human refugees by offering safety from the rampant monsters across the world. Guts, however, avoided entanglement in politics. His eyes were on the prize across the waters. At last, they reached the port city of Ratanus, where a grand tournament and war council were underway among nobles. Amid the bustle, they found a benefactor in Roderick, a dashing young sailor prince who had fallen in love with Farnese, to Farnese's surprise and Serpico's wary acceptance. Through Farnese's influential family, Roderick provided them with a sturdy ship, the Seahorse, to voyage to Skellig. On the docks, as flames of war with the Kushan Empire encircled the city, Guts's band fought off an attacking legion of Kundalini, sea serpent, summoned by Kushan sorcerers, and even encountered the legendary Nosferatu Zod again, though briefly, and Guts wisely avoided a drawn-out fight while protecting Casca. With a stroke of fortune, under the light of a full moon, they set sail. Guts stood at the stern as Vertanis faded from view, feeling an unaccustomed emotion. Hope. Elfhelm was within reach now. The sea breeze was fresh and carried the possibility that Casca's fragmented mind might be restored. Life at sea brought a strange peace at first. For the first time in a long while, there were nights when Guts could rest. Shirke cast protective spells around the ship's quarters, keeping evil at bay so that Guts actually slept in relative ease. The rocking of the ship, the endless blue horizon, and the camaraderie on deck all had a gentle, almost therapeutic effect on the wound-up travelers. Casca in particular was oddly happy at sea. The openness and gentle sound of waves seemed to calm the frightened child within her, and she would often stand at the railing with a simple smile, watching seagulls or reaching out to catch the spray of ocean mist. Farnese stayed faithfully by Casca's side, helping her eat and keeping her from wandering into danger on the ship. Guts finally allowed a moment to breathe. Sometimes found himself leaning against the mast at night, gazing at the moonlit water while his companions slept. On such nights, memories of the old band of the Hawk would visit him. Rather than fueling rage, these memories now felt more bittersweet. He could begin to cherish them rather than only mourn. And with Casca sleeping soundly cradled in Farnese's arms like a sister, and his new friends around, Guts felt a warmth he hadn't since those campfires years ago. He realized he wasn't alone anymore in his struggle. Of course, the sea journey was not without its share of battles and trials. The ocean held its own monsters. In one perilous encounter, their ship was attacked by a gigantic sea god, an ancient island-sized creature stirring after the world's astral and physical realms merged, a result of Griffith's new age. The sea god sent forth swarms of tentacled minions, including pirates it had absorbed and controlled. In a grotesque battle under stormy skies, Guts donned the berserker armor once more to carve a path into the sea god's very body. While his crew and friends fought off waves of fish-like monsters on the surface, Guts ventured alone into the belly of the beast, literally. It was a pitch-dark, surreal battle inside the cavernous stomach of the sea god. The berserker armor protected Guts from the creature's digestive acids and crushing muscles, but it also pushed him toward madness as he hacked away relentlessly at the gargantuan heart of the monster. Outside, Shirk, Farnese and Isidro coordinated to help. Shirk entered a trance, psychically guiding Guts through the sea god's insides like a lighthouse in the dark, whispering directions and pleading for him not to lose himself to the armor's influence. Farnese prayed and maintained a magic circle that helped Shirk's astral projection remain stable. Isidro and Serpico fought side by side on the sea god's back, desperately cutting down tentacles to prevent it from diving and drowning Guts inside. Puck and Evalera darted about, providing distraction to the monster's many eyes. At the climax, Guts found the sea god's enormous beating heart, and with a surge of berserker strength, slashed it to pieces from within. The sea god gave a final earth-shaking bellow and began to collapse. Guts nearly became trapped in the collapsing flesh, but a school of Marrow's sea spirits, one of whom, Isma, was a Marrow girl that had joined them temporarily, rescued him, carrying his unconscious body out of the sinking Leviathan just in time. The sea god died, freeing a coastal village from terror. When Guts was hauled back aboard the seahorse, battered and barely alive, his companions rejoiced. Casca even clapped her hands at seeing Guts safe, giggling obliviously, a simple gesture that nonetheless filled Guts's heart with relief and renewed resolve. After many weeks and hardships, one clear morning the mist parted to reveal the mythical island of Skellig on the horizon. bathed in sunrise gold. The island was lush and otherworldly, inhabited by elves, spirits, and the ancient flower storm monarch, the Elf King, though appearing as a serene elf queen named Danon. Stepping foot on Elfhelm felt like entering a gentle dream. For the first time in recent memory, Guts felt completely free of the brand's torment. On this hallowed ground, no evil spirit dared linger. Casca, too, seemed more at ease than ever, humming a little tune as butterflies of light fluttered around her curiously. They were welcomed kindly by the elves and the mages of Skellig, one being the witch Flora's spirit, subtly present in the blooms of the island. Danon, the elegant ruler of Elfhelm, listened to Shirke and Farnese's plea regarding Casca. With a sympathetic smile, she agreed to help restore Casca's mind. What followed was not a simple magical fix, but a delicate ritual called the Corridor of Dreams. Farnese and Shirke, guided by Danon, entered Casca's subconscious, literally journeying through the landscape of Casca's dreams to collect the fragmented pieces of her shattered psyche. For Casca, the time passed in a peaceful sleep under a great tree. For Farnese and Shirk, it was a profound and arduous experience. Inside Casca's dream, they witnessed haunting representations of Casca's trauma: a dark eclipse sky, monstrous silhouettes, a hound, Guts's presence in her mind, savagely guarding a trembling child effigy of Casca's core self, and everywhere the pieces of Casca's memories scattered like lost doll parts. Over what felt like hours, but was mere moments in the physical world, the two women safeguarded the tiny dream Casca from shadow demons and painstakingly gathered the dream fragments, remnants of Casca's memories and personality. They saw visions from Casca's life, her days as a fearless commander, her love for Griffith, her closeness with Guts, and the unspeakable horror of the eclipse. Both Farnese and Shirk nearly quailed in tears at understanding what Casca had endured. At the culmination, they assembled a symbolic doll, Casca's heart, together, and returned it to the dreaming Casca. Yet a warning manifested. An apparition of Femto hovered in the dream sky, a hint that if Casca woke, she'd remember everything, including that night of absolute terror. Despite the risk, Farnese and Shirk proceeded, driven by love and loyalty. With the final piece set in place, a rush of emotion blew through Casca's dream realm, like a gentle wind scattering the darkness. Casca's eyes in the dream sparkled with awareness. In the Healer's Grove, Casca's eyes opened for real. She sat up slowly, as Farnese and Shirka collapsed in fatigue from the ritual. Casca was herself again, truly herself. She gazed at her hands, at the elves around her, bewildered but lucid. Guts was standing a few yards away, not wanting to crowd her as she woke. His heart pounded. This was the moment he had longed for and dreaded all at once. Casca noticed Farnese beside her, recognizing her from fragmented recent memories and thanking her softly. Then she noticed the small form of Shirk, smiling shyly, and she gently stroked the girl's green hair in gratitude for guiding her back. Finally, Casca's eyes lifted and met Guts's. Guts, the mighty warrior who had stared down hordes of demons without flinching, now felt truly afraid. His hand shook at his side. Casca's expression shifted from confusion to dawning recognition to sudden tremor. In an instant, the memories of the eclipse, once sealed mercifully away, flooded her consciousness. Images of that red nightmare, of her comrade's slaughter, of Griffith upon her with Guts powerless to intervene, all surged through her mind. Casca's face contorted in horror. Before Guts could speak her name, she let out an anguished scream. The sound was like a wounded animal, full of pain and terror. She scrambled backward on the grass, eyes wide and fixed on Guts. No, not on him, but on the terrible memory he embodied. Guts stepped forward, arm extended, desperate to calm her. "Casca, it's all right. but he had forgotten he was still clad partly in the berserker armor he had donned pieces earlier during a sparring session. To Casca's newly restored mind, the sight of Guts in black armor with a beast skull helmet at his side only conflated him with her trauma. Her breathing became shallow. She clutched her head as panic overwhelmed her. Shirka and Farnese quickly moved to comfort Casca, casting reproachful, understanding eyes at Guts. He realized his mistake and removed the armor, revealing his face fully, tears forming in his eye. Still, Casca was inconsolable. She fainted into Farnese's arms, a panic attack rendering her unconscious. Guts stood there, arm outstretched uselessly, feeling his heart quietly break. He knew Casca might not be able to face him, or the past without pain. Dane had cautioned as much, but experiencing it was a brutal blow. All this way, all the battles and endurance, and now Casca was restored only to fear him. The warrior who had weathered every physical hurt now found a wound he didn't know how to heal. Casca's deep psychological scars, and by extension, the fragile state of their relationship. Tenderly, Farnese and Shirka carried the now slumbering Casca to a sheltered flower house to rest, agreeing to take turns watching over her. Days passed on Elfhelm. Days of gentle healing for Casca's psyche with therapy from the elves, yet Guts found himself at a loss. He remained on the periphery of Casca's awareness. She would ask occasionally about him, always kind as was her nature, but if he entered the same room unexpectedly, she would tense up or tremble. Guts resolved to give her space, however much it pained him. Under the boughs of Elfhelm's great trees, Guts began to feel something unfamiliar, a hollow kind of peace, a life without battle always at the door. But that peace was tinged with melancholy. His purpose for so long had been to restore Casca, and now she was awake but out of reach, at least for now. One full moon night, Guts wandered the quiet glades of the island, trying to reconcile what to do next. Was his role done? Would he and Casca part ways if she chose a different life now? As he mulled these heavy thoughts beneath a pearlescent moon, something miraculous occurred. The tiny demon child, whom Casca had birthed after the eclipse, and who had, unknown to most, merged with Griffith's new body, appeared in its true form as the Moonlight Boy. This ethereal mute child visited Guts's party occasionally on full moons, drawn by the love of his parents. That night on Elfhelm, the Moonlight Boy approached the sleeping Casca. When she awoke and saw the sweet, innocent boy, she felt at ease. She didn't know him consciously, but her soul recognized him as her child. Casca embraced the Moonlight Boy, and for the first time since regaining her mind, she felt pure joy. Guts, observing from a distance, saw Casca laughing softly as the boy played with her hair and brought her small wild flowers. It was a tender scene he hardly dared disturb. When he did step closer, the Moonlight Boy turned and gave Guts a smile, so serene and gentle that even Casca's shoulders relaxed. In the child's presence, she did not panic at Guts's approach. They sat together quietly for a short while, Casca cradling the boy and Guts sitting a few feet away, watching the two most precious people in his life find comfort in each other. But by sunrise, as always, the boy wandered off, and something astonishing happened. As the first rays of sun touched the boy, his small silhouette began to change, growing taller. In the blink of an eye, the Moonlight Boy transformed into Griffith himself, right there on Elfhelm's soil. The boy and Griffith shared the same body. Daylight belonged to Griffith. Guts's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. This was the man who had caused all their suffering, standing calm and beautiful as morning dew glinted on the grass. Casca's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. She collapsed to the ground, trembling uncontrollably, eyes wide with terror as she recognized the figure before her. All the terror and trauma of the eclipse surged within her. She could neither scream nor look away, locked in silent panic. Griffith gazed at her with an unreadable expression, Perhaps a faint remorse flickered, or perhaps nothing at all behind those inhumanly serene eyes. Rage unlike any other filled Guts. He roared and charged at Griffith, the dragon slayer drawn and cleaving through the air with the weight of all his hatred. But Griffith was faster now than any apostle, and his form was untouchable. He simply sidestepped Guts's swing with effortless grace. Guts's blade whooshed past, cutting only air. Again and again, Guts struck, each blow fueled by desperate fury for Casca's state and all the lost lives, but each blow failed to meet its target. It was as if an invisible barrier protected Griffith. Indeed, the tear in reality caused by his presence meant Guts's sword met only warp and shadow where Griffith stood. With almost tender calm, Griffith approached Casca. Zod, ever his guardian, swooped down and landed heavily nearby, keeping Guts at bay with a fearsome sweep of his taloned arm that Guts barely blocked. To Guts's horror, Griffith knelt and scooped Casca, frozen and faint, into his arm, his singular hand, as he still had only one corporeal hand. Something like longing or triumph flickered over Griffith's perfect face as he held Casca once more, as if she were an object to reclaim. That was the final straw. Guts let out an anguished scream and hurled himself at Zod and Griffith with reckless abandon. But Zod knocked Guts back with a powerful punch, sending him skidding through the dirt, still weakened from refraining to use the full berserker armor in Casca's presence. Within that split second, Griffith rose with Casca in arm and leapt onto Zod's back. The winged apostle unfurled his mighty pinions, and with a few beats ascended skyward carrying his lord and Casca. Casca! Guts bellowed, voice cracking. He scrambled up and in a feat of sheer will, hurled his massive sword end over end. The dragon slayer hurtled like a giant spear through the air aimed at Zod. It grazed the demon's flank, drawing blood and eliciting a roar of pain, but it did not stop their escape. Guts's sword plummeted uselessly into the forest below as Zod, with a burst of speed, disappeared into the morning clouds. Griffith and Casca were gone. A heavy, terrible silence fell over Elfhelm. Moments later, the very island itself shuddered. The magical realm of the elves began to collapse. Its fate entwined with the presence of the Falcon of Darkness, Griffith violating it. The great tree at the center of Elfhelm began to wither, and many of the beloved mystical residents, elves, sprites, and spirits, started to flicker and fade, returning to the astral world from which they'd come. Danon, the majestic elf monarch, approached Guts with sorrowful understanding as her form flickered like a dying candle. She explained softly that Fantasia, the merged world of fantasy and reality, was reaching a cataclysm. Griffith's influence was erasing safe havens like Elfhelm. In short, the age of magic was bowing to the age of the Falcon. Guts heard her words as if underwater. He fell to his knees, drained of all hope. Casca was gone, torn from safety by the one person in the world he could not fight. His companions rushed to him. Farnese and Shirk were weeping for Casca and for the crumbling paradise around them. Sir Pico stood grim-faced, watching the horizon as if expecting another attack. Isidro punched the ground in frustration. Puck hovered near Guts's shoulder, tears in his tiny eyes, murmuring, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Guts didn't respond. He knelt there, head bowed, feeling the weight of utter failure crush him. In his mind's eye he saw Casca's face as Griffith carried her off. Her expression of terror, and it stabbed him deeper than any blade. The island's collapse forced them to move. Roderick, Isma, and the crew scrambled to prepare the Seahorse for emergency departure as chunks of Elfhelm's cliffs broke into the sea. Guts's friends half led, half carried him onto the ship as the last enchantments of the island faded. They sailed away just as the mystical forest sank into mist and ocean, like a dream vanishing at daybreak. Guts stood at the stern, watching the beautiful island where so many hopes had been placed disappear under foaming waves. There were no words in him now, only emptiness and the distant echo of Casca's scream in his ears. Farnese approached quietly and draped a cloak over Guts's shoulders. He hadn't realized he was trembling. Shirk took his gauntlet hand in her small one, offering silent comfort and a promise that they would get Casca back somehow. But Guts didn't squeeze back as he normally might. He felt numb. As the seahorse charted a course back to the mainland, for there was nowhere else to go, Guts remained largely alone with his thoughts. The sun set and the moon rose cold and silver on the water. That night, in the ship's hold, Guts sat in darkness amidst crates of supplies. Through a hatch overhead, a single beam of moonlight fell at his feet. He removed the Berserker armor's helmet and stared at it. In its reflection, he saw a man he scarcely recognized, face drawn and haunted, hair now streaked with white from the armor's toll, eyes full of grief. He felt the beast of darkness stirring, whispering vile things. You couldn't protect her. You were too weak. Now she's with him. All because you held back. If you'd unleashed me, you could have torn them apart, saved her. Now what is left? Nothing but vengeance. Embrace me. Let's lose ourselves in slaughter. It's easier than this pain. For a terrifying moment, Guts considered it. To just surrender to the beast. Become a true monster mindlessly hunting Griffith until one of them was destroyed seemed almost a relief. Tears rolled down Guts's cheeks, unseen in the gloom. He truly believed he had lost the last light in his life. What was the point of struggling any longer? But then, faintly, another voice came, small, steady, and full of empathy. Shirka's voice, though she wasn't there physically, echoed through the corridor of the armor. She had sensed his darkening and entered the armor's psychic link. Please, Guts, hold on. We are here with you. Farnese, Serpico, Isidro, me, we're all still here. We haven't lost everything. Not yet. And another voice, Farnese's, unsure but earnest. Sir Guts, you once taught me to overcome my fear. Now it's my turn to tell you. Do not lose to yours. Casca wouldn't want that. In the gloom, Guts's lone eye widened slightly. These people, his friends, still believed in him, still needed him. If he gave in now to despair or rage, he would be abandoning them just as he feared he had abandoned Casca by failing to save her. In that moment, Guts realized, as long as he was alive, his story wasn't over. Casca was still alive too. She was in the hands of the enemy. Yes, but not beyond hope. A flicker of resolve, faint but growing, lit in his chest. He painfully stood up, using the Dragon Slayer as support like a massive cane, and ascended to the moonlit deck where his companions were gathered in anxious vigil. They turned as he approached. Farnese's eyes were red from crying. Serpico looked tired yet vigilant. Isidro was angry and sad all at once. Shirky wiped her wet cheeks and attempted a brave smile toward Guts. Puck fluttered near Guts's face, concerned. In the gentle lunar glow, Guts saw not only their grief, but also their unwavering trust in him. They silently awaited his leadership. What next, Captain? Guts looked at each of them. The family who remained. He thought of the hawks he had lost, and how these dear comrades had filled that void piece by piece. Even with Casca taken, he was not truly alone unless he chose to be. Taking a deep breath, Guts finally spoke, voice low but clear in the hush. We will get her back. The simplicity of the statement belied the immense task, but its certainty made Farnese and Shirk break into relieved, determined smiles and Isidro cheer under his breath. Serpico nodded solemnly, hand on his rapier. In the nights that followed, Guts allowed himself to lean on his companions more than ever before. He delegated Casca's care to Farnese's capable devotion and Shirk's gentle magic. He entrusted group decisions to a council among them rather than bearing everything alone. In doing so, he found that the burden on his soul lightened just enough to keep him from sinking. He spent hours by the prow, gazing at the stars. One night, as Puck hovered nearby tinkling softly a lullaby-like tune, Guts closed his eye and made a quiet vow beneath the wheeling constellations. I will continue to struggle, for Casca, for my friends, for the tiny chance of a better dawn. The sea breeze carried away his whispered words as a vow to the universe. Dawn broke one day on the sea of fate with a gentle golden warmth. Guts stood at the bow of the ship, watching the horizon brighten. It had been a long, painful journey, years of fighting, surviving, and protecting those he cared for against impossible odds. The label struggler, what the Skull Knight had called him, fit him more than ever, and though wounds seen and unseen covered him, he was still here. As the sun's first rays touched his scarred face, Guts closed his eye and felt their warmth. In that moment, he recollected something Godot the blacksmith had told him long ago in a winter cave, that maybe, just maybe someday, he could find something beyond the battlefield to live for. Back then, Guts hadn't understood. Now he did. He had found things far more precious than revenge. Companionship, the responsibility to those who believed in him, and the simple yet profound desire to see Casca smile without fear again. Behind him, the door to the cabins creaked open. Farnese stepped out onto deck, wrapping a shawl around her against the morning chill. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly, as she joined Guts's side. Guts gave a faint shake of the head. Shirk and Serpico soon followed, and Isidro scampered up the rigging like a restless monkey to scout the view. One by one, his friends gathered around him, none pressuring him, just sharing the dawn. Guts realized that even in Casca's absence, this was his new band. Not mercenaries bound by a leader's charisma, but friends bound by shared hardship and loyalty to one another. They had chosen to follow him even to Elfhelm and back, not for glory or a king's coin, but out of genuine camaraderie and love. In that realization, Guts felt a surge of gratitude and a resurgence of purpose. He began to speak quietly, words rumbling from deep in his chest, addressing them all. "Haven't been myself lately. I almost lost sight of why I keep fighting, but you all kept me tethered. Thank you." Farnese's eyes widened slightly. Rarely did Guts express such sentiment. Shirka smiled brightly, nearly tearing up again. Serpico closed his eyes and bowed his head with a respectful grin, and Isidro hopped down nearby, trying to act like it was no big deal but clearly heartened. Puck flew a happy loop-the-loop, chiming, "That's what friends are for, right?" Guts turned and faced them fully. Determination emanated from him like an aura, and for the first time in a while it was not stained with blind rage, but steadied by resolve. "We will find a way to reach Falconia," he continued, voice growing stronger with each word. "We'll save Casca. Even if the odds are 1,000,000 to 1, I won't stop." He placed his hand over the brand on his neck, noting silently that it bled less now in his friend's protective presence, and almost smiled. "Not until I've fulfilled my vow to protect her, and until we've settled things with him on our terms." The others nodded firmly. They didn't have all the answers, but together they had overcome so much that even the idea of infiltrating the shining utopia of Falconia to retrieve Casca seemed possible eventually. The ship sailed onward, back toward the mainland's uncertain future. Over the next days, plans were tentatively discussed, perhaps to seek allies among other nations or apostles who opposed Griffith, perhaps to train further. Shirke offered to teach Farnese more magic. Isidro redoubled practicing sword drills taught by Guts. Serpico engineered new weapons to exploit Griffith's presumed weaknesses. Each comrade contributed their hope to the group, rekindling Guts's own. One starry night, Guts found himself on watch duty, atop the ship's mast, looking out at the dark expanse. The familiar pull of the brand was quiet. no demons nearby for now. In that peace, he allowed one memory to surface gently, that of Casca, placing a small hand on his cheek years ago under a summer night, telling him softly that he looked nice when he wasn't scowling. The Casca of now wasn't ready to say such things, but maybe, just maybe, one day she could heal beyond fear. If Guts could help build a world where she felt safe and free, that would be a victory far greater than any defeat of an enemy. As if on cue, a shooting star streaked across the sky, its reflection glimmering on the midnight sea. Guts closed his eye and made a simple wish upon it. He didn't speak it aloud, but it resonated in his soul. Let me be strong enough. When morning dawned again, he felt a little stronger. The Black Swordsman, bearer of the Dragon Slayer, the struggler against fate, rose to greet the sun with renewed will. There was much to do. Lands to traverse, information to gather, a rescue to plan. And Guts would do it. All of it, with the patience and persistence he had earned through endless nights of adversity. He realized something profound. Struggle was not just his curse, it was also his gift. It meant he continued through pain, through loss, through even moments of despair. He continued. That perseverance was a light in itself, inspiring those around him and pushing back against the darkness bit by bit. Later that day, Shiarki found Guts polishing the massive Dragon Slayer blade. She asked quietly if he was okay. Guts paused, considering, then gave a small nod. He still hurt. He would carry the ache of Casca's absence every waking moment. But as he looked at Shiarki's earnest, youthful face, Farnese braiding Casca's spare ribbons into a new talisman, Serpico teaching Isidro a clever sword feint on the aft deck, and Puck fluttering around offering fish snacks to Evalera, he realized he also carried something else. Hope. I will not break, Guts thought to himself, gripping his sword's hilt with steadiness. The beast of darkness was quiet inside him now, slumbering in the face of his calm determination. His eye, once wild with bloodlust, was clear. He would master the berserker armor, master his rage, and wield them as tools for good, not be mastered by them. He would chart a course guided by the bonds he had, not just the enemies ahead. On the eve of their arrival back on the continental shore, Guts's party gathered once more under the twilight sky. The conversation turned to the daunting challenges awaiting them on land, the many unknowns of Griffith's new world. Fear lurked in each heart, but they took solace in each other. Guts listened to each of them voice their hopes and worries. When all had spoken, they looked to him. Guts simply planted the Dragon Slayer in the earth at his side and said, "We've made it this far. No matter what comes, we'll make it further. Together." It was a straightforward statement, yet coming from Guts, it held nearly oath-like weight. The group around him straightened, faces shining with confidence. In the back of his mind, Guts remembered nights by the campfire years ago, thinking he had to walk his path alone to find purpose. How wrong he had been. His purpose was right here: protect his friends, save Casca, defy the merciless fate imposed on them, and perhaps, though he rarely dared admit it, carve out a slice of peace for himself as well. As darkness fell and stars peeked out, Farnese began a soft hum of a familiar lullaby. A tune, Shiarki said, was heard in Casca's dreams, and one by one, the others joined in or listened, letting the gentle melody soothe their weary spirits. Guts sat among them, silent but present, sharpening a few bolts for his arm crossbow, and occasionally glancing up at the night sky. He thought of Casca beneath those same stars somewhere in Falconia. He silently sent her his promise. "I'm coming for you. Wait for me just a little longer." In this way, under the vast tapestry of night, the Black Swordsman and his comrades sailed onward to new battles and unforeseeable dangers. Yes, but also toward the faint glimmer of a better future they all yearned for. And Guts, the eternal struggler, felt the ember of hope in his chest ignite into a small flame. It would not easily be extinguished again. He would fight. He would endure. He would struggle on until the stars themselves grew dim, because that was who he was. And as long as he kept getting up, no matter how many times life knocked him down, his story, and Casca's, and all of theirs would go on, and maybe one day reach the light. The sea breeze blew softly as Guts and his friends leaned against the ship's railing that night, each lost in thoughts but sharing the comfort of one another's presence. Overhead, the celestial river of the Milky Way gleamed. Guts found himself speaking quietly, almost to himself. "It's a beautiful night." Sheark heard and replied with a smile. "Yes, it feels like the stars are encouraging us." No one disagreed, and so they remained for a while in companionable silence, gazing up. One star in particular twinkled a bit brighter, reflected in Guts's amber eye. He took it as a sign, for though much had been lost, much still remained. And while he drew breath, while his heart continued to beat, he would not let the flame of hope die. Guts the struggler would continue his journey, one foot in front of the other, one swing of his sword at a time, forging ahead through the dark toward whatever dawn awaited him and those he loved. And in that steadfast resolve, as the night slowly yielded to the gentle promise of a new day, Guts felt something almost like peace. He was still alive. His story was not over, and as ever, beneath all the tragedy and fury, his indomitable spirit, scarred, yes, but unbowed, kept fighting for the light.